Also one comment about this Cuba. I mean, I'm also a bit skeptical, but Cuba has very good health indicators, and so it can't be such a big disaster because, I mean, I don't know whether you compare it with the availability of food in British supermarkets, but I mean, at least they seem to be able to feed their population. The two questions is actually, what are we going to do? I mean, you said empowering farmers, so I mean, this sounds good, but how do you empower them? My question there is, would world citizens or basic income for everybody give them power, or what are the alternatives? And for corporations, should we get rid of them, or should we democratize them, turn them into co-ops, or what is the way forward? So these are the two questions. Thank you.
Just a couple of things. One to Raj, it was really about, you talking about colonialism as one of the causes. I would have thought the slave trade's quite important, given the commodities that were traded and the huge amounts of profit made. That there must be and actually the damage that those commodities are now doing in terms of diabetes, sugar, etc., etc. There's a very good book by E.P. Thompson called Customs in Common, and there's a discussion about the market and prices, and there's an example, I don't think it's Leeds, but it could be Leeds, where prices used to be determined by the local corporation, and there was a fight to establish the markets by the merchants, and the response of ordinary people was to stop grain going to the corn exchanges and say, are you going to sell it at the established price, or are you going to sell it at the market price? So the market has always been an area of dispute amongst the poor and the rich, and I'm sure this is happening around the globe. And the last thing is really, when I was at school, we did all about the enclosure movement, how efficient, you know, all of a sudden Turnip Townsend and all these people were in terms of producing food. And it strikes me that that's one of the things that is continually being rolled out in Africa, with the big corporations buying up land to produce these mega crops that are now dominating our lives. The last thing is, I've got an allotment, and one of the ironies is that if you go to Marks and Spencer's and look at their rhubarb price, it's £1 a stick. And can I say, I live in the rhubarb triangle, which is like Wakefield. My allotment, I worked out, is worth about £3,000 at the moment.
Getting to the idea of, I don't know how to take this. Maybe let's start with corporations and how to reform them, because you know, in the United States, we're fighting a big fight around corporate personhood, whether corporations can legally be people. And we've had a ruling from the Supreme Court saying that yes, they can, and that has a lot to do with the way that our politics now is behooved. I mean, is really beholden to. Sorry, let me stand up. Beholden to corporations, no matter whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. So one might say, well, you know, reforming corporate personhood is a good idea, and we could take we could look at Adam Smith, Adam Smith was deeply suspicious of corporations existing in perpetuity, where the incentives of the executives in a corporation were not aligned to those who owned stock. So, I mean, Adam Smith thought that the kind of corporations we have today were a bad idea as well. I mean, ways of getting things back into line to something that Adam Smith would approve of would be to time limit the charter of corporations and to insist that there were ways in which the executives were also people who suffered the consequences of their actions in one way or another. But even if you imagine even if we imagine just cooperativizing corporations, all of them, they now have to be co-ops somehow, they would still operate within the market that they have created. And so it's important not to fetishize the corporation, but to understand that it is both, it's in relation, it's a dialectical relation with the market itself. And we need to understand that the market today is something where corporations have managed to exist where they don't have to worry about paying social costs. They don't have to worry about environmental costs. And if we are to have just people getting together in organizations, which I think is a good thing, and working together, we need to have constraints that are socially agreed upon and ways of setting prices that are socially agreed upon, and agreements on certain things that should belong in markets and things that don't. I mean, I think we can all agree people, slaves, do not belong in markets. But we're perfectly happy to say that some things should belong in markets, that clothes, for example, might want to belong in markets because you don't want the government telling you what to wear. But there has to be some way in which, if clothes end up in the market, they need to be, they need to be fair wages for all. A global minimum wage and a global maximum wage sound to me like a good idea. But again, the way you get there is through this sort of democratic, sort of food sovereignty discussion around food and food prices. And again, it always comes back to this idea of efficiency and how to set a price. And one of the things, as you were saying, that the market has always been this contested place. One of the things that Via Campesina in India is very keen on, it's not just India, in the US as well, is setting a fair price for food. And by setting a fair price for food that's socially agreed upon, you can smooth out fluctuations and you can perform the insurance function that futures trading currently does. And by having a sort of socially agreed fair price for food, you actually end the process of food speculation, because futures contracts are just a way of saying, look, you're a farmer, you want to know what price you're going to get for something you grow this year, and a futures contract will lock in that price for you. Trouble is, if there's a catastrophic failure in harvests, you won't even get that because you have nothing to sell. So having certainly fair prices is important, but having a bigger social insurance mechanism is important too. And that's not something corporations can provide. So we need to have that discussion away from corporations, and we need to be able to have that's what a food sovereignty discussion would look like. Now, in terms of the future and in terms of Neil's provocations around Cuba and Sydney, I mean, I certainly think you're right. If you look at Cuba, it's the indicators for Cuba suggest that nobody is going hungry in Cuba. And I was there last year, and I saw obesity, and obesity is a problem in Cuba. But and of course, the quality of food in Cuba, it's like Britain in the 1970s. I mean, the things people eat in Cuba are very disappointing. It's some of the worst food you will ever eat. But there's not an insufficiency of it. And in fact, there's a lot of interesting agroecology that's happening in Cuba. People are not happy in Cuba with the government, but when it comes to hunger and when it comes to healthcare, people are poor, but they're not starving, not least in the ways that you see in the United States. But there is an interesting question around how it is that cities will feed themselves in the future. And I think that this is a question about efficiency that I think is really interesting, because corporations set themselves up as, that monoculture is a very efficient way of farming. But it's only efficient if you look at the numbers that they want you to look at. If you look at yields and you forget about environmental costs, if you look at the acreages, but you forget about the healthcare effects of consuming food in this way, or if you ignore the fact that the pesticides that are being used have long-term environmental and social consequences. So there was a report that came out a couple of years ago that I was very, very excited by, and it was a report looking at how it is that we will feed the world in 2050, when there are 9 billion people. And this is just a way of responding to the population question without descending into a crude Malthusianism. It's important to ask the question of how will 9 billion people eat in the future? And this report was called, and I commend it to your reading list, the International Agricultural Assessment on Knowledge, Science and Technology for Development, the IAA-STD. These people didn't go to acronym school, but it's a good report. I mean, these were 400 peer-reviewed. 400 scientists produced this peer-reviewed document looking at how people would eat in the future. And what they came up with was, look, actually, industrial agriculture is inefficient. We won't in the future have the cheap fossil fuels that are necessary to be able to grow food the way that we do today. The efficiencies of today's agriculture are a trick of cheap fossil fuels. Remove those fossil fuels and you're buggered. Similarly with water. Industrial agriculture requires an abundance of water. Remove that and you're in trouble. Industrial agriculture and monocropping requires constant climate. Remove a smooth, predictable seasons, and again you're in trouble. That's why polyculture is a much smarter way to go, because you have a portfolio rather than a single bet in your fields. And so what they're saying is, particularly in urban and peri-urban areas, we need more farms. We need to be thinking much more about rooftop gardens. We need to be thinking about urban and peri-urban agriculture. And that does mean rethinking how cities look and how cities are planned. And that may be an impossibly big thing to think about. But but our modern cities are in many ways artifacts. I mean, I live 500 miles from Los Angeles. And I try to tell people in Los Angeles, look, imagine 50 years from now the water footprint of Los Angeles and the way things look. Los Angeles won't be here. And people are like, no, that could never be. But 100 years ago, Los Angeles wasn't there either. Not in the same way. And the crises of agricultural inefficiency are an attempt, or a moment for us to get to reimagine not just food and food distribution, but urban architecture and urban planning and the way that our cities work. And you can see some of this already happening. You can see in Cuba, for example, that there is more urban and peri-urban agriculture that's agroecological and that is hurricane-proof. That they are, rather than using monocultures, they're using polycultures that are much more robust in terms of extreme climate change events. And that kind of thinking about urban space and urban planning is something that we need if we're going to get the more efficient future and one that's much more robust in terms of climate change. And again, corporations won't do that.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Okay.
Hi, Laura from London Group. So I'm sort of thinking of this question as I'm asking it, but I just wanted to know your sort of views on the argument between trying to maybe push the existing corporations into a system of markets that have been constrained and reformed to prioritise social interests. I'm thinking things like the Fair Trade Foundation, and also maybe if there was, a similar agro-ecological mark that could be attributed and that could be a target to go for, or do you think it's that's absolute nonsense and the best way to do is to just be really focusing on supporting sort of small-scale alternatives that will eventually, you believe will replace these corporations?
Thank you. I wanted to know if you both thought that anything good came out of the Hunger Summit, and if not, or if you have reservations about it, what kind of action would you suggest that we take now?
Hi, quite a straightforward question really. You mentioned briefly about means of regulating food speculation. If you could just briefly explain what have been put in place since your 2010 report and just demonstrate, evaluate how effective they've been so far. Thanks.
Fantastic, good question.
Yeah, the discussion began by making the point that there was plenty of food. The problem was distribution. The problem with distribution was that people didn't have enough money. But we managed to end up talking about the food system and the production of food as if that itself is a problem. So I'm just wondering, who is actually going hungry, where, and why?
Very good. The people at the top of the food pyramid, or this hourglass thing, are farm workers. They're the people who are most likely to be going hungry. And this is, of course, the deepest irony when it comes to issues around hunger, is that the people most likely to be dying of malnutrition, of undernutrition, are people who work in rural areas growing food. Farm workers, remember, are people who don't have access to farmland. They are too poor to be able to be farmers. And so they're dependent on wage work, and that's why they, when food is priced out of their reach, they will go hungry and they will die. That's the kind of acute end of hunger. But there's also psychologically and physically a very important level of just being food insecure, of not knowing where your next meal is coming from. That's a much bigger category. So when we say people are undernourished, and there are around 1 billion people who are undernourished, that's a much smaller number than the number of people who are food insecure. It doesn't include, for example, the 50 million people in the United States who are food insecure. But it is poor people around the world who are food insecure. And that also points to another issue that we need to address when we're thinking about the food system, which is that if we are going to have fair prices for food, we need to make sure that everyone is able to afford to eat. And again, that gets back to the thing we were talking about earlier on with slow food, is that the answer to problems in the food system is not more cheap food, which again is what corporations are offering, right? If you look at Michelle Obama in the United States wanting to solve the problem of food deserts, her solution is to have Walmart come in. Walmart, the famously gouging, low-wage work providing. If you're working at Walmart, you're usually on food stamps in any case. You're on some sort of benefit to enable you to eat. That's not the solution. The solution is to make sure that everyone has a living wage. That's the solution to ending hunger right now. But we did get onto this bigger question around efficiency. And I mean, I don't think anything good came out of the Hunger Summit. I think that, and I was particularly worried by the extent to which some NGOs found themselves co-opted by the IF campaign, found themselves supine before the government, finding themselves cheering on for a program that is, as I say, I mean, it is a way of deepening corporate power, particularly in Africa, facilitating land grabs, and not being aware that they're not listening to the voices of people in the global south who are coming out very loudly with alternatives that are inimical to the new Alliance for Nutrition. So, I mean, I would say that there are alternatives that we can support if only we wanted to. And I think that we should get behind some of those rather than, oh, someone's being Skyped. Rather than signing up to govern. I mean, I think it should be the role of the non-governmental, of civil society never to pair with government, but always to be in opposition, demanding better. Because what government is always in the business of doing is brokering compromises. Why compromise before when there's something we're fighting for that's much bigger than government is prepared to concede? So I think that it was very disappointing to see so many organizations in that space becoming, NGOs becoming GOs, or just plain O's. So that was a little sad. But in terms of tactics and fair trade, I wanted to I mean, I buy. I mean, here's the gag. I mean, I buy fair trade coffee because what's the alternative? Blood on your beans coffee? I want coffee with the blood of small children. I want exploitation coffee. No, of course, you buy fair trade coffee, it's the right thing to do. But is fair trade in and of itself going to transform the structures of the global economy? Well, no. So I'm perfectly happy for some people to fight for the juggernauts of these corporations to be moved a degree. But in the long run, I think that by the time that juggernaut gets to the other side, we'll have a different country than which they land. I mean, I think that there's there's only so much kind of reforming corporations that you can do. I had a lovely conversation with the head of corporate social responsibility at Unilever. He's a lovely man, and he's a very honest man, and his honesty makes him, and he puts it like this: if there's a win for Unilever and a win for the community, they'll do it. But if there's a win for Unilever and a loss for the community, they'll do it. And if there's a loss for the community, a win for the community and a loss for Unilever, it won't happen. And the trouble is that in that quadrant of win for the community but loss for Unilever is where most of the important stuff needs to happen. So I think that there's, if we're thinking about fair trade certification, I think that's okay, and I'm happy for that to be, if as a result of a tactical discussion, people are ready to say, fair trade stamp is a good thing. And as I say, I buy fair trade because at some sort of nominal consumer level, I think that's important. But I think that the work that we need to do, particularly as WDM, is a much more radical kind of work than providing the new label that, when you go into the shop, you make sure now that it's organic and fair trade and dolphin friendly and tuna compatible, and another label is going to make you feel that bit, that bit less guilty. But it's not going to. I mean, I think at the margins it makes a difference. But we're interested in bigger margins than that, I think.
Great, thank you. So there were a couple of, there was a question about food speculation, so I'm happy to kind of do my best to explain where we're up to with that campaign. So basically, we have been kind of following a piece of EU legislation through the rather onerous process, which is EU decision making for the last now about 18 months. And so back at the end of 2011, the European Commission proposed put forward proposals to regulate the food futures and related markets in Europe. And what we've been basically calling for was more transparency. So first of all, so that we actually know what's going on in these markets, and certainly we can't do any more about regulating them if we don't even know what's happening. But then the second thing we were calling for were what's known as position limits. So these are simply limits on the number of contracts that any trader can hold for a speculative purpose. And these are limits that were used in the US for most of the 20th century on their commodity markets. You know, it's a kind of tried and tested solution to this problem of excessive speculation exacerbating volatility, and so that's what we've been calling for in this European process. And so the way the process goes is the Commission makes some initial proposals and it sends them off to the other two European institutions, which is the European Parliament. So we all elect MEPs, so representatives of the European Parliament, and they have a chance to look at this proposal and either say that they were happy with it or to suggest amendments to it. And simultaneously, the same process happened in the Council of Ministers, which is basically the finance ministers from each of the EU member states. Now, at the end of last year, we had convinced the European Parliament that rather than accepting the Commission's proposals that yes, countries could use these limits if they wanted to, but if they didn't want to, that was fine. They could kind of carry on with business as usual. So that we saw as a real step forward from this voluntary limits to what is now in their text, which says these countries have to use these limits. There's no, you can use them if you want, but you don't have to. This is everyone must use these limits. And just this week, we've got to a very similar stage with the Council of Ministers saying basically, essentially the same thing. It's kind of going to be rubber stamped when the finance ministers meet next week, but it's been agreed at the kind of negotiators level that they will also settle for that kind of those amendments to the text, which will mean that these limits have to be put in place rather than being optional. Unfortunately, there are still quite a few loopholes in both of those versions of the text, which mean that these limits won't apply to all contracts as the text is currently written. But the good news is, hopefully, that there's still a way to go, so that the sort of final stage of the process is that these three institutions come together to kind of bash out a version of the text that they're all happy with. And so that is our kind of last opportunity to try and get rid of some of these loopholes and make sure that the limits that it looks like we're going to end up with will actually apply to all the contracts and not just, you know, a few handpicked by the industry. So certainly we've seen the legislation strengthened since the initial proposals at the end of 2011, but there's, you know, still a bit of work to go if we want them to be efficient and cover all the contracts that they need to be. So hopefully that's a not too techy summary of where we're up to with regulating food speculation. Just a couple of things to add on the other questions. On the question of the Hunger Summit, certainly we're really concerned both with the kind of campaigning or lack of it that's gone around the Hunger Summit. So we've not seen the criticism of the discussion in the Hunger Summit from as broad a swathe of civil society as we would want to, and I think we're really concerned that actually people think that the government's done the right thing on this and they have done far from it. And then also the second thing is the way the discussions are going are really undermining the more kind of democratic processes of tackling food insecurity, which are much more inclusive kind of negotiations that go on through the UN and the FAO's Committee on World Food Security. So the G8's kind of initiatives, the kind of things that were being discussed at the Hunger Summit last weekend are really undermining much better approaches to dealing with these problems, and that's something we're really concerned about. But I think what we would say is, as I sort of alluded to at the start, as our sort of work on food speculation is winding down along with the legislation, and hopefully we'll be declaring some sort of victory there. We are hoping to do more work looking specifically at the push by agribusiness in the global south, and so challenging both agribusiness itself, but also the way that the UK government is supporting agribusiness companies at the expense of small-scale farmers, and really putting the pressure on there to hopefully shift both the debate and the policy. So stay tuned for our new campaign on that, which will be coming probably in the early part of 2013, but local groups, you'll hopefully be hearing a little bit more about it a bit ahead of that. And then the last thing I guess I was going to say on this question of, how do we achieve change, I guess was the question, and do we push the corporations, or do we start with the alternatives and support those to kind of fill the space we'd like to see them. And I guess from WGM, our answer is, well, actually, we need to be doing both, and that's what we've been trying to do on our food campaign for the last few years. So both, we've been, fighting for regulation, and let's be clear, this is about rules that companies have to follow. This is not going to ask banks nicely, oh, please will you stop speculating on food. And as we've seen, there have been victories in terms of food speculation and getting banks to kind of pull out of these markets, but we've also seen, and Deutsche Bank is a great example of this. Deutsche Bank is one of the top 5 investment banks involved in food speculation, and last year they said they were suspending their involvement in food speculation because of concerns around the impact this was having. Lo and behold, earlier this year they decided, oh, it's okay, there's no problem with food speculation, and they're straight back in. So let's be clear, we're not going to settle for voluntary commitments. We're calling for regulation of the system we've got, but alongside that we're also doing our best to support both the UK and kind of global food sovereignty movements, because ultimately that's where we think change will come from.